Journalist Zaid Jilani proposes taxing college endowments on elite private schools in order to provide financial relief to students who need it, instead of the more traditional route of burying students in student debt. Journalist and co-founder of Inquire More, Zaid Jilani, joins us to discuss the idea further. Zaid, thanks for joining us, and tell us more about this.
Yeah, so to tell you guys a quick story, I went to grad school in Syracuse, New York. I went to Syracuse University, and about 50% of the property, or maybe a little bit more than that even, of the property in Syracuse, New York can't be taxed because it's owned by nonprofits. Now, what are those nonprofits? They are large universities, large hospitals, and maybe some smaller religious institutions or other kind of charitable groups. The reality is that many of our largest universities, in fact, most of them except for the for-profit colleges, have nonprofit status, meaning they have untaxable property. And changing that through the law is kind of a can of worms. People have wanted to change it for universities, people have wanted to change it for churches. It's really a difficult thing to do. It can have a lot of unintended consequences. Yet we have all this property that's untaxable, and you have communities that are struggling, and you have students who go to these universities who are charged more and more as their endowments grow. And it feels like we don't have any policy levers for that, right? Well, the Republicans actually discovered when they passed their tax law in, I think it was in 2017, that they could actually pass, there is part of a university that you can tax, which is the endowment. So they passed an excise tax, which basically serves as a carried interest kind of tax on the university. It's very small, but actually it started generating revenue from the college endowments. And so actually recently, a few months ago, Tom Cotton, a Republican senator from Arkansas, said that we should go further. He introduced something that he's basically calling the Ivory Tower Tax Act. And what it would do is it would levy a 1% tax on the fair market value of the endowment. So it serves as more of a wealth tax. If the other thing was kind of like a carried interest tax, which kind of reduced produced a very small amount of money, this would produce a significant amount of money. And I think it was something like $2 billion a year, right? And it would kind of, I think, get us on the road to having some amount of accountability for the amount of money that a lot of colleges are sitting on. It's funny, J.D. Vance, who's running for Senate in Ohio, has called Harvard a hedge fund with a university, right? Because I think it has something like a $40 billion endowment. Some of these universities are sitting on an enormous amount of cash. And what's good about Cotton's bill is that the tax basically encourages the universities to spend down the endowments, meaning they should be using them for tuition and aid, or they should be using them for other kind of pro-social purposes in their universities, because if they spend it down, I think then the tax won't go into effect at the same amount. And also, I think that he redirects a lot of the revenue for those taxes towards vocational and training programs for students. So like actually alternatives to something like an Ivy League education for maybe people who aren't at that level, who didn't have the education to get into something like an Ivy League school. So I think there's a lot of positives about Tom Cotton's bill. And I also think that even though Republicans dislike colleges much more than Democrats do, which is probably why Tom Cotton's introducing this bill and not Bernie Sanders, I do think it's more politically sustainable than people realize, because the smaller excise tax that they passed in 2017, no one's really talking about repealing that. I think a lot of Democrats also are thinking, especially when college affordability is such a huge issue on their side and student debt is such a huge issue on their side, they're thinking these colleges are charging our kids so much money, why can't they pay a little bit more in taxes? And there is a way to do it by targeting these endowments.
When Democrats have proposed a wealth tax in the past, the response from the right has been, oh, it's just so complicated. It's impossible to accurately measure wealth in order to then actually pay the tax. So what has Cotton figured out here? And can the left use it to kind of universalize this wealth tax?
Yeah, I think when people say that, and I think Larry Summers has said that, a lot of people have said that, there have been some wealth taxes imposed in parts of Europe and Western Europe. I do think that their administrative challenges was more of the amount of money they were generating, because one, their wealth taxes started at a very low dollar figure, so maybe they encouraged more invasion and stuff like that. And two, a lot of those countries, they don't have as many rich people hoarding stuff as the United States does, to be quite frank. So that was probably more of the problem than the actual administrative part. They do say things like, well, how do you value a painting or a sculpture or other random stuff that rich people happen to own? And that's not really an issue with a college endowment. It's a certain amount of money, right? And it collects and it gathers interest, which is what the excise tax is on. It's not very hard to figure out what the value of a college endowment is and how much they would pay. So I think this one's very straightforward. I think in terms of universalizing it, I think that would be pointing to other examples, other places in the world. Like France had a wealth tax at one point. I think Switzerland had one. Other places had one. using them as kind of models or examples for how you might use this in other contexts. I do think that it's probably a little bit harder to do that with, a person who has a bunch of old vintage cars or, I don't know, paintings or whatever rich people like to collect. It's probably a little bit harder to do that than it is to calculate the value of a college endowment. But I think it's doable and it's worth trying, at least in a pilot form. And I think that it was kind of smart what the Republicans did by passing a much smaller version of this in 2017. And now Tom Cotton wants to take it to the next level. I think the Democrats could do the same thing with a wealth tax. They could apply it to only certain types of goods or certain types of property, and they could expand it out. Or they could do something like, expand the estate tax or something like that, because that's more or less a de facto wealth tax. So I think there are paths to kind of start small and then prove the success and then move forward. And that's kind of what I would do in this case.
Well, and I think the key to this issue, and you hit on it, Zaid, is that the money that would be, that the revenue that would be generated from this would then go toward paying down students' costs to attend, investing in vocational education, making education more affordable. If it simply was a tax that was then going to go back to the federal government, I wouldn't say that would be necessarily a good use of resources. But Zaid, schools such as Harvard and Yale receive millions in research money from the federal government and are tax exempt. You brought up the point that since private colleges and universities create an enormous amount of debt, why not treat them like a predatory industry?
Yeah, I think, and to their credit, I think the Obama administration in particular had started to do this with for-profit colleges, which I think are the worst offenders in many ways, because they really give students degrees that are near useless, and they have very high default rates for their graduates and so on and so forth. So I do think that we have started to look in that direction, but this is much bigger than the for-profit colleges. I mean, the colleges in the United States, they are basically going to 17-year-olds and telling them that anything they pay, even if it's $50,000, $60,000 in tuition and cost of living and boarding and so on and so forth, is just an investment. It's all going to come back to you, right? They're not upfront with giving students statistics about their return on the investment for the different degrees and so on and so forth, which actually I think Betsy DeVos under Trump had tried to promote a practice of them doing that. I don't know how successful she was. But in many ways, it is not that different at this point between credit card companies coming to late teens or early young adults and trying to get them to load up on a bunch of credit card debt. It's not that different from what colleges and universities are doing in many cases. And I think we need to start looking at them in an adversarial way. I think it's fine to talk about different types of student loan relief, what's the most progressive way to do it, talking about a free college path, what's a good way to pay for students' educations who are, willing to work hard and study hard. But also we need to talk about the cost of college itself, right? It's kind of unsustainable to have basically a blank check from the government to offer loans to any student who wants to go to these colleges and to have the tuition keep going up and up and up. We need to be talking about some means of price controls on the colleges. And normally when you talk about price controls, libertarians say, okay, you're going to limit supply if you do that. It may not be such a bad idea with colleges and universities to limit supply in some cases. A lot of the programs are garbage, and not necessarily everyone needs to be going to not necessarily everyone needs to be going to a 4-year residential college. I think a lot of people getting an associate's degree or going to a vocational education and so on may actually be more helpful or useful for their lives. But colleges want students to be embracing this model because it helps with their own growth and their own endowment. So I don't think that the progressives are off base by saying we need to do more to help students afford college. But we also need to be thinking about the underlying cost of college itself and things we can do in that regard. And I do think something like the Cotton proposal to be taxing the endowments would at least encourage universities to think about how they're using their money wisely and actually have a little bit of fear about political backlash to some of their practices. So.
Yeah, their tuition has gone up well beyond the rate of inflation. So it has been definitely predatory. Going back to Cotton's proposal here, is he getting any pushback, and if so, from which side of the aisle?
I haven't seen a whole lot of pushback. I haven't seen a whole lot of people rising to the occasion and saying, oh, this will burden Harvard University or Yale University. But I haven't also seen a lot of support. I haven't seen any Democrats embrace this legislation. I haven't checked recently, but I don't think any Republicans are really jumping on board to co-sponsor either. So he's kind of, I think it's a smart proposal, but it's also maybe a little bit ahead of the curve. I don't know that too many members of Congress are seriously talking about ways to hold colleges accountable, outside of what we mentioned earlier, which was sort of some of the for-profit college accountability and the small excise tax that they passed in 2017 on endowments.
A very good proposal from Harvard graduate Tom Cotton. Zaid, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
And we'll have more Rising after this.